Good afternoon. Thank you, Shirley, for having me here to discuss our updated intake estimate for trans fat by the U.S. population. Trans fat has received attention due to its widespread consumption and its adverse health consequences associated with coronary heart disease. Scientific evidence shows that industrial-produced trans fat, or IPTFA, added to food increases serum low-density lipoprotein cholesterol and consequently increases the risk of coronary heart disease. Scientific evidence also shows that in addition to increasing LDL cholesterol, the consumption of IPTFA also lowers high-density lipoprotein cholesterol, which may further increase the risk of coronary heart disease. Because of these concerns, the Institute of Medicine has stated that trans fat consumption should be kept as low as possible while consuming a nutritionally adequate diet. IOM has also stated that an upper limit is not set for trans fat because any incremental increase in intake increases the risk for coronary heart disease. Likewise, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Department of Health and Human Services 2010 Dietary Guidelines for Americans also recommends trans fat intake be as low as possible. On July 11, 2003, FDA published a final rule amending its regulations on nutrition labeling to require that the trans fat content be declared in the nutrition label of conventional foods and dietary supplements. The purpose of this rule, which took effect on January 1, 2006, was to help consumers make heart-healthy dietary choices by providing them with additional information to reduce their intake of trans fat. In this final rule, the intake for IPTFA was estimated to be 4.6 grams per person per day for adults. Since this rule published, many food products have been reformulated to either eliminate or substantially reduce IPTFA. There are a few reasons why we have chosen to update our intake estimate for IPTFA from that presented in the 2003 final rule. The Office of Food Additive Safety is currently reviewing 2 citizens' petitions. In 2004, the Center for Science in the Public Interest submitted a petition asking us to revoke the generally recognized as safe status for all added partially hydrogenated food oils. And in 2009, we received a petition from Dr. Fred Kummerow asking us to ban the use of partially hydrogenated fat in food. In addition, it's been over 5 years since trans fat labeling became mandatory, and by comparing the current intake of IPTFA with that estimated in the 2003 final rule, will allow us to gauge how intake has changed since this rule published. Therefore, given the concern regarding the public health impact of consuming trans fat, the subsequent reformulation of many food products to reduce the trans fat content since publication of the 2003 final rule that established labeling requirements, and as part of FDA's evaluation of the citizen petitions that were submitted to the agency, a new assessment of the intake of trans fat was undertaken. The primary dietary source of IPTFA are partially hydrogenated oils, which are used as ingredients in a broad range of food products and for frying food. PHOs have a long history of use as food ingredients. The partial hydrogenation process was developed in the 1930s and has been in widespread commercial use since the 1940s. Trans fatty isomers in the oils are created during the hydrogenation process, and the trans arrangement of the hydrogen atoms increases the melting point, shelf life, and flavor stability of the oil. The trans fat content of PHOs is controlled by the temperature, pressure, reaction time, catalyst, and fat source. The trans fat content of partially hydrogenated oils can vary from approximately 10 to 60% of the oil, depending on how the oil is manufactured, with an average of 25 to 45% of the oil. There are sources of trans fat in the diet other than partially hydrogenated oils. Some non-hydrogenated refined oils and fully hydrogenated oils may contain some trans fatty isomers. For non-hydrogenated refined oils, small amounts of trans fat isomers could form due to heat treatment, and the level formed is highly dependent on the refining conditions. Data on the typical trans fat content of foods produced from or prepared with non-hydrogenated vegetable oils suggests that less than 2% may be formed during the deodorization of vegetable oils. In addition, low levels of trans fat may be found in fully hydrogenated oils due to incomplete hydrogenation. However, the intake of trans fat from the consumption of non-hydrogenated refined oils and fully hydrogenated oils would be expected to be minor compared to that from the use of partially hydrogenated oils. Trans fat isomers can also occur naturally in products of ruminant animals. In the 2003 final rule, the intake of naturally occurring trans fat was estimated to be 1.2 grams per person per day for adults. The intake of naturally occurring trans fat was not expected to be significantly different from that estimated in the 2003 final rule. Therefore, our estimate focused on the intake of IPTFA from the use of partially hydrogenated oils. The 2003 final rule mandated how trans fat is declared on the product label. The rule requires that the amount of trans fat per serving be declared on a separate line directly below the statement for saturated fat. For those products containing less than 5 grams of trans fat per serving, the trans fat content is expressed to the nearest 0.5 gram per serving. And for those products containing greater than 5 grams of trans fat per serving, the trans fat content is expressed to the nearest gram. For those products containing less than 0.5 grams of trans fat per serving, the content may be declared on the label as 0 grams. For products that contain less than 0.5 grams of total fat per serving, the statement "not a significant source of trans fat" may be used instead of a declaration of trans fat content if no claims are made about the fat, fatty acid, or cholesterol content of the food. Foods sold at deli and bakery service cases are exempt from labeling unless the food bears a claim or other nutrition information. And for details, please consult the nutrition labeling regulations in 21 CFR 101.9. In our current intake estimate, we used a variety of sources to determine the trans fat levels in food products. Food product label surveys were conducted at local grocery stores in the greater Washington, D.C. area from October 2009 to May of 2010. Product categories known to currently or previously contain IPTFA were targeted. And from the product label, we collected data on the grams of trans fat, grams of total fat, grams of saturated fat, and serving size. In addition, when available, information on the trans fat content from the websites of manufacturers was also used. Based on product label data and market share information, products were identified for analysis for IPTFA, and I will talk about this more in a few slides. Market share information was obtained from a database containing proprietary supermarket scanner data collected from the sales of food products in supermarkets, drugstores, mass merchandisers, and convenience stores in the U.S. The data used were for the week ending September 1st, 2007, which were the most current at the start of this project, and represent the market nearly 2 years after the trans fat labeling rule took effect. Market share information was used to help identify commonly purchased items in various food categories and to refine the levels of trans fat in foods used in the intake estimate. From our product label survey, we collected data on approximately 2,000 products covering more than 40 food categories. As I mentioned previously, this was a comprehensive survey of those product categories that were known to currently or in the past contain IPTFA. Of the 2,000 products surveyed, approximately 600 contained partially hydrogenated oils, and of those 600, approximately 200 contained greater than or equal to 0.5 grams of trans fat per serving. Some initial observations from our label survey were as follows. Some food categories have been reformulated to completely remove partially hydrogenated oils. Some examples of food products in this category are frozen potato products and frozen seafood. There are some food categories that contain partially hydrogenated oils but have trans fat levels below the limit of detection of the method, which was 0.1 gram per 100 grams. I will discuss the analytical method further on the next slide. Some examples of food products in this category are canned soups, cereals, peanut butter, and flavored potato chips. In some categories, consumers have a choice of products where some manufacturers have reformulated while others have not. For example, baked goods had trans fat levels ranging from 0 to 3 grams per serving. Frozen pizza and frozen pies had trans fat levels ranging from 0 to 4.5 grams per serving. And microwave popcorn had trans fat levels ranging from 0 to 7 grams per serving. For these categories, a value of 0 grams trans fat per serving indicates that the product either did not contain a partially hydrogenated oil or contained a partially hydrogenated oil with a trans fat level of less than 0.5 grams per serving, thereby allowing the label to indicate a trans fat value of 0 grams per serving. There were a few categories where there is limited or no consumer choice of a low trans fat product. For example, all frostings that we surveyed contained trans fat at a level of 1 to 2.5 grams per serving, and most refrigerated dough products contained trans fat at a level of 1 to 3.5 grams per serving. A number of food products were analyzed using AOAC Official Method 99606, which had a limited detection of 0.1 grams per 100 grams. Each food product was analyzed in triplicate for total fat, trans fat, and fatty acid composition. Information from the product labels, including the name of the product, the nutrition information, and the ingredient list, was obtained for the analyzed products. Analytical data were obtained for approximately 130 foods, and emphasis was placed on those products where little or no label data were available, such as in-store bakery items, and on those products listing a partially hydrogenated oil ingredient on the label and a trans fat value of 0 grams per serving. Based on the data, it was determined that for those products containing a PHO and listing 0 grams trans fat on the label, most contain less than 0.3 grams of trans fat per serving, and some contain trans fat below the limit of detection. 3 populations were chosen for our intake estimate. We first determined intake for the U.S. population aged 2 years or more. We also determined intake for 2 subpopulations, children aged 2 to 5 years and teenage boys aged 13 to 18 years. Children were chosen because their intake is generally larger when reported on a body weight basis. In addition, certain food categories such as fruit snacks and cookies, which contain partially hydrogenated oils, are more commonly consumed by children. Teenage boys aged 13 to 18 years were chosen because this population tends to consume the greatest quantities of food, and in particular processed foods such as donuts and savory snacks that typically contain PHOs. Therefore, teenage boys are expected to represent the intake of IPTFA at the high end of the intake spectrum. Intakes were estimated on an eaters-only basis, meaning that the estimate represents the intake of IPTFA by the individuals in the population who consumed one or more of the foods identified as containing IPTFA over the survey period. Intakes were estimated at the mean and the 90th percentile, where the 90th percentile represents the high intake consumers of a given food. Our basic approach used to estimate the intake of IPTFA was to use 2-day food consumption data from the 2003-2006 National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, otherwise known as NHANES. Approximately 40 food categories were identified as containing PHOs, and over 1,300 food codes were assigned across these food categories. Next, an IPTFA level was assigned to each of these food codes. A combination of food label data, analytical results, and market share information were used as appropriate to assign an IPTFA level to each food code. Where no or limited data were available, conservative assumptions were used. Analytical data were used for those food codes corresponding directly to an analyzed product. For example, a name brand candy bar was analyzed, and those data were used for the food code for that candy bar. Analytical data were also used for those food codes for which analytical data were not available for a specific food, but for which a suitable surrogate was analyzed. For example, a name brand puffed corn cereal was analyzed, and those data were used for the food code for a generic puffed corn cereal. Label survey data were used when there was a direct correspondence between a product and a food code, but no analytical data were available. Some food categories contained a broad range of trans fat levels for a given food code, and therefore label data were used to represent an average level of trans fat for that food code to ensure that intake was not significantly overestimated or underestimated. Market share data were used for select food codes where there was a broad range of trans fat levels among different brands. For those food codes where there were no analytical data or data from a suitable surrogate, and when a product label indicated that the product contained a partially hydrogenated oil, but listed a trans fat value of 0 grams per serving, it was conservatively presumed that trans fat was present at a level of 0.4 grams per serving. And as I mentioned earlier, most of the products analyzed that listed a value of 0 grams per serving on the label contained less than 0.3 grams of trans fat per serving. Therefore, the use of 0.4 grams per serving is sufficiently conservative. This is a list of the food categories that were used in our intake estimate, and I will not go through all of them, but you can see that it covers a wide variety of food products, from breakfast foods to cakes, cookies, cereal, crackers, frozen pizza, ice cream, granola bars, pies, tortillas, etc. The intake of IPTFA at the mean and the 90th percentile was estimated for each of the food categories on the previous slide. Listed here are the intakes for a few representative categories. One thing to point out is that those categories with the highest intakes listed are not necessarily the highest contributors to the cumulative intake of IPTFA. In order to identify the food categories that significantly contributed to the cumulative intake of IPTFA, consideration must be given to how many individuals consume the foods in the food category, that is, the percent eaters for the food category, and whether the food is consumed as is or as an ingredient in another food category. For example, the intake for frosting in the table is high, but the percent eaters are low. Therefore, once the percent eaters are factored in, the frosting category would not be a major contributor to intake. This is because the frosting category is for those who consume frosting directly from the container. However, most people typically do not consume frosting this way, but rather as part of a frosted cake. Therefore, the intake of IPTFA from frosting would be included under the cakes category. And I do have a slide a little later in the presentation that indicates those food categories that are the major contributors to the cumulative IPTFA intake. The intake of trans fat from fast food was calculated differently. The fast food category contained a wide variation of trans fat levels and a broad range of fast food items. To allow for this wide variation of trans fat levels, a Monte Carlo model was used. Trans fat levels were obtained from surveying nutrition information on the websites of fast food chains. The trans fat content of fast food varied depending on both the type of food and the fast food chain that prepared the food. The data were consolidated and sorted into food categories. The data for food categories that were likely to contain predominantly naturally occurring trans fat, for example, hamburgers and milkshakes, were not considered further. These food products contain components that are potential sources of IPTFA, for example, hamburger buns. However, the contribution from these components is captured in the food categories already considered and were shown on a previous slide. Furthermore, the label survey indicated that these components are typically not significant sources of IPTFA. Over 250 food items were grouped into 10 fast food categories: French fries, onion rings, mozzarella sticks, hash browns, French toast, fish sandwiches, chicken nuggets, fried chicken, and fried seafood from 15 different national fast food chains. The Monte Carlo model iteratively sampled intakes from food consumption distributions for each food category and combined that data with IPTFA levels sampled from fast food IPTFA data sets. In this study, 100,000 iterations were run, in which each iteration could be considered to represent the intake of IPTFA from the consumption of fast food for a simulated person. The mean IPTFA intake for each category, as well as the overall intake for fast food, was calculated. When the analytical data, label data, and market share data were combined with the Monte Carlo data for the fast food category, we estimated an intake of IPTFA of 1.3 grams per person per day at the mean and 2.6 grams per person per day at the 90th percentile for the U.S. population aged 2 years or more. Similar intakes were also estimated for children 2 to 5 years of 1 gram per person per day at the mean and 2 grams per person per day at the 90th percentile. The highest intake of IPTFA was estimated for teenage boys aged 13 to 18 years of 1.8 grams per person per day at the mean and 3.6 grams per person per day at the 90th percentile. As I mentioned previously, this slide indicates those categories that were the major contributors to the overall intake of IPTFA for the U.S. population aged 2 years or more. The following categories: savory snacks, frozen pizza, cake, which includes the contribution of frosting on a frosted cake as appropriate, cookies, margarine and spreads, coffee creamer, and pie, contributed 0.91 grams or 70% to the overall intake of IPTFA. There are certain individuals or populations that may consume food products containing substantial levels of trans fat. Therefore, a worst-case scenario was also estimated. In this scenario, the highest IPTFA level was used for each food code. For example, the frozen pizza category contained a range of trans fat levels from 0 to 4.5 grams per serving. For this scenario, it was presumed that all frozen pizzas contain trans fat at a level of 4.5 grams per serving. This scenario would significantly overestimate intake because in most cases, consumers have the option to select a food that does not contain IPTFA or contains IPTFA at a lower level. In addition, given the variability in products on the market, it is not likely that an individual would consume all the foods in each food category containing the highest level of IPTFA. For the high intake scenario, the intake of IPTFA was estimated to be 2.7 grams per person per day at the mean and 5.4 grams per person per day at the 90th percentile. As before, a similar intake of 1.9 grams per person per day at the mean and 3.8 grams per person per day at the 90th percentile was estimated for children aged 2 to 5 years. Once again, the highest intake was estimated for teenage boys aged 13 to 18 years of 3.9 grams per person per day at the mean and 7.8 grams per person per day at the 90th percentile. The intakes for the high intake scenario were approximately double that estimated previously for all the populations considered. However, the intake of IPTFA for the worst case scenario was still lower than that estimated in the 2003 final rule for all populations considered. In order to corroborate our intake estimate for IPTFA, the intake of trans fat was also calculated using the 2009 USDA National Nutrient Database for Standard Reference, Release 22, as an independent data source. USDA SR is a major source of food consumption data in the U.S. and has been compiled from published and unpublished sources. Published sources include the scientific literature, and unpublished sources include those data obtained from the food industry, other government agencies, and research conducted under contracts by USDA's Agriculture Research Service. USDA SR22 includes data on 1,534 trans fat containing food items that represent 25 different food categories. Trans fat levels in SR22 were combined with consumption data from the 2003-2006 NHANES to yield an intake estimate. The intake based on USDA SR22 data was similar to that estimated based on analytical data, market share data, and label survey data for all populations considered. Therefore, a similar intake of trans fat was estimated using two independent data sources. We also estimated the intake of trans fat from non-hydrogenated refined oils. Small amounts of trans isomers are found in non-hydrogenated refined oils as a result of the geometrical isomerization induced by the high temperatures used during deodorization. One study in Canada indicated that the trans fat content of non-hydrogenated vegetable oil varied from 0.05% for extra virgin olive oil to 2.4% for canola oil. Food consumption data in USDA SR22 indicated that refined vegetable oils contain trans fat at a level of 0 to 1.8% of the total fat, and most common vegetable oils, with the exception of canola oil, contained relatively low proportions, less than 1% of trans fat. Considering that PHOs could contain trans fat at up to 60% of the total fat, the intake of trans fat from non-hydrogenated refined oils would be expected to be considerably lower than that from PHOs. The USDA SR22 intake estimate included the intake of trans fat in refined oils that are used for cooking purposes or as salad oils. However, the intake estimate based on market share information, label survey data, and analytical data accounted for trans fat intake from non-hydrogenated refined oils only in those products that contain a PHO, not in those products that did not contain a PHO, such as salad dressing and household frying oils. Using NHANES and the recipe files for 10 commonly consumed oils, the mean intake of non-hydrogenated refined oils by the U.S. population was estimated to be 30 grams per person per day. We conservatively presumed that trans fat was present at a level of 2% in these oils. This resulted in an estimate of the contribution of the intake of trans fat from non-hydrogenated refined oils to be as high as 0.6 grams per person per day for the U.S. population. Combining this with the estimated intake of IPTFA of 1.3 grams per person per day for the U.S. population aged 2 years or more suggests that the intake of IPTFA could be as high as 1.9 grams per person per day. In summary, the current intake of IPTFA was calculated using market share information, label information, and analytical data. The intake of IPTFA from the use of PHOs was estimated to be 1.3 grams per person per day at the mean and 2.6 grams per person per day at the 90th percentile for the U.S. population aged 2 years or more. For the high intake scenario, the intake of IPTFA was estimated to be 2.7 grams per person per day at the mean and 5.4 grams per person per day at the 90th percentile for the U.S. population aged 2 years or more. The intake estimated using analytical data, market share data, and label information was similar to the intake estimated using an independent data source, USDA SR22. And overall, the intake of IPTFA has decreased from that estimated in the 2003 final rule of 4.6 grams per person per day at the mean for adults. A reduction in trans fat intake is expected to occur, albeit at a slower rate, as there are few products to reformulate, and as industry faces challenges with those products that have yet to be reformulated. However, the efforts to reduce IPTFA levels in food will be helped by legislation from states such as California, which as of January 1, 2011, banned all foods served in food facilities containing 0.5 grams or more of IPTFA per serving. In addition, Walmart announced an initiative on January 20, 2011, to remove all remaining industrial-produced trans fats, partially hydrogenated fats and oils, in all packaged food products from its stores by 2015. While the intake of IPTFA has decreased, there are certain individuals with certain dietary habits that may still consume relatively high levels of IPTFA if certain brands or types of food products are frequently consumed. Consumers can take an active role in lowering their intake of trans fat by both reading the trans fat content of the food listed on the Nutrition Facts panel, as well as the ingredient list for a given food. Consumers should remember that even if a food claims to have 0 grams of trans fat, it is still a good idea to look at the ingredients. Thank you very much for your attention. I would be happy to answer any questions that you have. And I've also included my email address if you would like further information.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on to our next presentation because time is not going to permit us to respond to questions. I realize there are quite a few questions, and they have been nicely pulled out for me so that they're not scrolling by as I try to read them. But we just need to move on. We won't have time to entertain questions. I think one of the things that you may send her an email or look at fda.gov to find out more information about trans fat.